The same offense some of us take at hearing the Murdoch Mafia called a dynasty, we take at them being called great lawyers. A good lawyer wins by good knowledge of law and an honest application of that law. The Murdochs, especially Randolph Jr., better known as Buster, behaved atrociously in court. If he attempted such methods today, he'd be disbarred, not lauded. There are standards of professionalism that attorneys are held to. There's a variety of punishments that can be doled out if they're not followed. They can be held in contempt, given fines, and at worst, be disbarred and imprisoned, as Corey Fleming and Alex Murdaugh presently are. To the best of his ability, Buster ensured the support of everyone around him, from the jurors to the jurists to the powers that be. Almost no one was keeping him in check in the courtroom. The ugly tobacco stains he left on the floors of every courthouse he worked in were nothing compared to the stains he left on the legal profession in the 14th Circuit judicial system. How? This is the story of the man of many nicknames, the self-proclaimed cock of the walk, also called Big Daddy and Buster, Randolph Murdoch Jr. Let's get started. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is the Murdoch Mafia, Rise and Fall, Episode 2. They Call Me Big Daddy. Welcome. This episode is dedicated in memory of Gladys Marvin Murdaugh, who deserved better. We left off last week at the strange and suspicious death of Randolph Sr., so that's where we'll pick up today. As a quick review, in case you weren't here for that episode, Randolph Sr. was hit by a train at 1 a.m. when leaving a friend's home, some say from a game of poker. He had been very unwell for some time and was slowly dying a painful death from uremic poisoning, kidney failure, and an enlarged heart from a serious heart defect. The train's crew testified that he had driven up on the tracks at the very last moment, smiled, and waved as the train bore down on him. But what happened after that? Just 3 days after Randolph Sr.'s death, Buster announced that he intended to take up his father's post and run for solicitor. Because Randolph Sr. had been running unopposed, the entry list for candidates had to be reopened to allow for new candidates, which included not only Buster, but W.J. McLeod. McLeod's campaign point was his age and experience, trying to make it seem that Buster was not equipped for the role. Buster fired back by mentioning all the time in the last year he'd filled in for his father or assisted him with the solicitor duties. In fact, in February 1939, one of the times that Randolph Sr. was hospitalized, Buster had stepped in for him and quickly won 4 of the 5 cases he tried in just 1 day. After his debut, he stood in for Randolph Sr. for most of the year. Buster is given the position of solicitor until the November elections, a role he will win and hold until 1986, with a short removal in the 50s that we'll discuss in a later episode. He didn't just jump, he dove into the role. He picked up his father's amusing theatrical court appearances and expanded on them. But in addition to that, he had the cocky assuredness that only a second-generation person in power can have. Randolph Jr. didn't just rely on those two weapons. He went even further. I watched a documentary about John F. Kennedy when he was campaigning to become senator for the first time. He was young, inexperienced, sickly, and was having trouble slipping into the role that his father had actually meant for John's older brother, Joe, who'd passed away in an explosion aboard an airplane as he flew a rather risky mission during World War II. JFK grew frustrated at times and would tell his father how he was not Joe and he couldn't do it. His father, undeterred, sent him out every day to knock on doors and shake hands with the constituents. There he would be, hour after hour, shaking hands with the men, kissing babies, and charming women of all ages, until his right hand ached so badly he'd have to switch to shaking hands with his left. Then, the very next day, he'd be back out again. In the meantime, the women in the family were holding luncheons and tea parties, making housewives feel special and excited to be able to say they'd had lunch with the Kennedys. This kind of personal touch should never be underestimated. Though it's not more important in actuality, it can be a more powerful tool than skill, knowledge, or experience. It works in job interviews, relationships, and many areas in life. And this is the approach that Randolph Jr. took in his role as solicitor. We'll dive much deeper into that in following episodes. As I mentioned in the introduction, we often hear a lot of praise about the legal skills of the Murdoch men, especially Randolph Jr. But when you hear these supposed skills described, none of them have anything to do with an actual application of law or legal knowledge. In fact, Buster's performances were often irreverent towards the law he swore to uphold. His antics weren't simply questionable. He actually faced disciplinary action for them more than once. He threatened, bullied, and even bribed juries, as he would laughingly tell his guests during evening gatherings. He threw guns across courtrooms towards the jury box. He wrapped a hose around his neck and lay on the floor of the courthouse as he spoke to the jury. As I said, we will break these things down much more in later episodes. But none of these antics, though memorable, are well-honed legal skills or anything we would say actually makes a great attorney. So why did so many people have that impression? Because he'd charmed them. Buster spoke to every person he came across throughout every day of his life. He wasn't just a man who everyone else knew who he was. He knew who they were too. Sam Cruz, a historian who knew Buster, described a time when his own father stopped at a store with Buster on their way to go fishing. His father would say, "Don't go to the store with Buster Murdaugh, because he knows everyone in there, and those that he doesn't know, he'll find out who they are before you leave." This wasn't just being friendly. This was a tactic. Every person in the store or on the streets where he walked was a potential future juror. He wanted them to remember his kindness and friendliness in the hopes that when and if they took that seat on the jury, they'd vote in favor of their old pal Buster. He was careful to include everyone, from poverty-stricken folks to high society. He let the downtrodden believe he was their Robin Hood and still hobnobbed with the rich elite in places like Charleston and Hilton Head. But let's step back in time a little bit to introduce his wife, who we heard a little bit about in the last episode, the lovely Gladys Marvin. Gladys Willis Marvin was the daughter of William Horace Marvin and Bertha Ida Marvin, maiden name Willis. Gladys was born in Yemisi and grew up at the Mackey Point Plantation, where she would later marry Buster on June 24, 1937. Shortly after graduating from Columbia College, which at the time, by the way, was a prestigious all-female college. Buster's earliest memories were of attending trials with his father, where he became enamored with the lifestyle of being a solicitor. Buster attended the University of South Carolina like his father before him, and like many of his descendants after him. It's said that in 1934, he was given the same nickname his father had been given while playing on the Gamecocks football team, Buster, after a particular game where he'd made nearly all the important tackles and busted an opposing player. Legendary coach Billy LaValle, former minor league baseball player whom the state newspaper called the best collegiate coach in the history of South Carolina after he produced 7 winning football seasons in a row, is the one said to have given him this nickname, adding that he expected to make him one of the best linemen Carolina had ever seen. While Randolph Sr. had quickly shed his nickname after leaving college, Randolph Jr. kept it. This is kind of the way for juniors or thirds and so on in families. With the name confusion, they're often left with nicknames to distinguish themselves. Off the field, Buster was the vice president of his freshman class, a pledge in the fraternity Pi Kappa Phi, and was busy wooing Gladys, whom he'd already met by this time. Gladys was a local beauty, noticed by many other young men besides Buster. Lieutenant Colonel James Walker DeLoach wrote an essay decades later mentioning the first time he saw Gladys during a girls' basketball game. She left such an impression that all this time later, he wrote, "Lord, she was pretty," and appropriately embarrassed by the stares of the young men who watched her play basketball. He added that he doesn't remember who won the game, but Buster was the real winner because he got to marry her. Shortly after the marriage, Buster joined his father's firm and Randolph III was born on October 25, 1939, a little less than 9 months before Randolph Sr.'s death. Buster had a privileged upbringing, with his father owning one of the first cars in Hampton. His father had also co-owned a boat since Buster was in high school, and the family would take weekend boat trips that sometimes included the governor. The well-to-do Murdaughs would host many decadent parties and elaborate lunches that were extravagantly decorated, and where prizes were given to the attendees. In 1936, the state newspaper made the statement that although Randolph was a prosecuting attorney, he had more friends than any one man in the section. This was the atmosphere where Buster grew up, and no doubt when he had begun to realize on his own or had been told to realize by his father the importance of good connections. But this lifestyle was not built to last. By the next year, not long after the death of his second wife Estelle, and with the Depression slowly stretching through the years, it was now taking hold of most of the country. Randolph Sr. lost most of his wealth when one of his banks failed. It was terrible timing for Buster as he was attending college. As reported in my currently favorite book about the Murdochs, Swamp Kings by Jason Ryan, Buster's tuition was paid through a football scholarship, and he worked 2 to 3 jobs at a time, depending on the season. He started early in the morning, working for the South Carolina Highway Department. He then attended classes later in the morning and worked for the State Insurance Commission in the afternoon. When the legislature was in session, he worked in the State House as a clerk. It was during this time that other events, seemingly unrelated, were developing, the effects of which would change Buster and Gladys's happy lives. The story actually begins much further back with the man by the name of Ruth Vaux, who was born in Philadelphia on January 25, 1786. According to his Wikipedia page, he was an attorney and later a judge. He was also a philanthropist on a very large scale. He was a Quaker whose beliefs and values of morality guided his actions in his life and in his public service. He was an abolitionist before it had even occurred to most of his contemporaries. He founded the Pennsylvania public school system, where he held the first presidency of the Board of Public Schools of Philadelphia for 14 years. At one time, he was a member of more than 50 philanthropic societies. In addition to being an abolitionist, he took an interest in Native American issues. He helped found the Pennsylvania Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, the School for the Blind, the Philadelphia Savings Fund Society, and other benevolent societies of the city and state. He also played a part in the creation of the Frankfurt Asylum for the Insane, now known as Friends Hospital, and he labored zealously in the cause of prison reform. Quakers are conscientious objectors to war, and therefore have different political outlooks on anything surrounding war, so Vaux refused several public posts offered by President Andrew Jackson. Before his early death, at age 49 from scarlet fever, he wrote a number of books and memoirs that you can find on the internet today. Robert Vaux had a son named Richard. After studying law, Richard Vaux was admitted to the Pennsylvania Bar in Philadelphia on April 15, 1837, and in 1839 was elected a member of the State House of Representatives, then a delegate to the Democratic State Convention in 1840. He had 6 children, the 5th one being Jacob Vaux. Jacob Vaux became the father of Ruth Vaux, who was a well-known heiress and socialite, and she is the reason we took this trip to Philadelphia. On October 6, 1936, this little gem of an announcement was put out in the Post and Courier. It describes her as the girl with whom Harry Cram, Foot Point, South Carolina plantation millionaire, will say his vows next month. It mentions that 2 years ago, her name was headlined by the national press when she and her chauffeur were attacked by 2 hoodlums. 2 hoodlums, both of whom are still behind bars for the attempted crime. Describing her great-grandfather is such a treasure here, the one-time mayor of Philadelphia, where he is remembered as an eccentric old gentleman remaining true to the revolutionary style of dressing to the day of his death, patent leather pumps, silk knee breeches, and an embroidered frock-tail coat. Sometimes called Harry, sometimes called Henry, Cram was a millionaire originally from New York, but ended up settling in South Carolina, where he lived out the rest of his life. The story was that he had done something disgraceful, although I haven't been able to find what that was, and the family had banished him to South Carolina, where they owned a large plot of land and supplied him with living expenses so long as he stayed down there and called his mother every day to report. There are many tales of Henry Cram, but mostly stem from the fact that he was a young man with a seemingly endless money supply and nothing to do in life but to drink, throw parties, fish, and hunt. His prey weren't the only recipients of his bullets, though. It's said that one day when bored, he decided to shoot jars of jam in the house. Another time, when he decided to quit drinking, he locked up the liquor in his closet. Later, when his addiction got the better of him, he found he'd misplaced the key and resorted to shooting the closet open, putting holes through every suit in the closet. There are many such tales out there about things that happened on his island and things that he did that could make up their own series. But basically, he's where I picture Paul's life heading had the Murdochs been more wealthy and had Paul not been murdered by his own father. Henry had been married before to Edith Kingdon Drexel, an extremely wealthy and well-connected socialite from New York. They had a son together named John Sargent Cram. Sadly, Edith passed away from pneumonia in 1934 at the age of 23, leaving Henry a single father. Shortly after the wedding announcement, it was advertised that Ruth was coming for a hunting trip to Harry's estate in South Carolina. It referred to her as an outstanding cross-country rider, saying that she could hold her own and had been riding to the hounds ever since she was big enough to stride a mount. So says this article from October the 11th. But 10 days later, the two secretly married on October 21st around midnight. They went to the home of Judge L.S. McCormick, who performed the ceremony with his wife as witness. Their marriage started with a literal bang as their car overturned in a crash not long after they said their vows. They were only minorly injured and were soon on the way to their honeymoon. We'll come back to Mr. and Mrs. Cram in a bit. Let's get back to Buster for now. Buster and Gladys had moved into Randolph's old home, the home that had been built after the last one burned down in 1915. From there, Gladys continued to host her elegant luncheons and garden parties, welcoming plenty of high-level guests. On most weekends, Buster and Gladys were on the go. They visited friends, attended Gamecocks games, or went to their beach home in Edisto, but never venturing outside of South Carolina except for one trip to Florida on the first anniversary of Randolph Sr.'s death. In October 1940, Buster sued the railroad, claiming that poor maintenance of the rail crossing had contributed to the accident causing his father's death. He hired State Senator George Warren to formally represent him, which no doubt helped his side a great deal. Warren had been a friend of Randolph Sr., serving as the first circuit solicitor before Randolph from 1916 to 1920. In fact, Warren had helped pass legislation to create the 14th Judicial District. In 1916, instead of running for re-election in the South Carolina House of Representatives, he successfully ran for the new open circuit solicitor seat. He served one term and retired to run for the U.S. Senate in 1920. Although his U.S. Senate campaign failed, he remained active in politics, holding positions such as presidential elector, president of the South Carolina Bar Association. He returned to the South Carolina legislature and served in the South Carolina Senate from 1938 until his retirement in 1950. But back in the day, he had shared office space and even a file cabinet with Randolph Sr. Warren was well connected, and through him, Buster made friends with Judge Strom Thurmond, who would become governor in 1947. In the last episode, linked in comments, we heard the testimony from the train crew who all confirmed that Randolph had been sitting in front of the tracks blinking his lights for some time, and in spite of the constant blowing of the train's whistle, he had at the last moment drove up on the tracks, where he smiled and waved as the train hit him in his vehicle. They testified that it was a clear and quiet night with a bright shining moon, and that anyone who wanted to get out of the vehicle could have. But in his complaint, Buster makes the claim that Randolph's car was stalled on the tracks, that the train had failed to signal within 500 yards of the crossing, that the crossing was neglected, causing it to be overgrown with brush. He went on to contend that the air was heavily laden with fog, though the engineer, brakeman, and firemen had remarked on what a clear, bright night it had actually been. Buster went so far as to accuse the engineer of not looking out for passengers. How must that poor engineer, who probably had PTSD from that night, no doubt reliving the accident over and over, like a horror movie stuck in his head, have felt at that accusation? In the end, or should I say, beginning, as this was a foregleam of how cases would continue to go for Buster, the railroad decided to settle out of court for an undisclosed amount that to this day we don't know. When World War II had started back in 1939, life hadn't changed much at first for Buster and Gladys, or much of anyone in the United States really, until the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, when the United States entered the war in earnest. Henry Cram joined the U.S. Guard and was deployed to guard the Panama Canal. His new wife, Ruth Vaux Cram, joins the Navy when it created the WAVES program, which stands for Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, in 1942. As a solicitor, Buster was exempt from service, but both he and Gladys got involved in ways to support the war locally. Gladys was a part of the local sort of USO project that had been set up, supported by the people of Hampton, in June 1942. She's described in this article from February 1943 as providing the soldiers with dancing partners. Buster became chairman of Hampton County's chapter of the Red Cross on December 17th and started raising war funds. It's during this time that Ruth and Buster meet. Ruth no longer wants to serve in her position in the WAVES program and asks a smitten Buster to help her withdraw. She told him how she longed to return to Foot Point to care for her plantation and convinced him that that was where she could help the war effort the most. He'd never met a woman quite like Ruth, sophisticated, elegant, world-traveled, and worldly wise, and he finds himself wanting to help this beautiful damsel in distress. So he uses his influence as chairman of Hampton County Red Cross to help her out of her situation, even taking trips to see U.S. senators. He secures her release in September 1944. Though he has a beautiful wife of his own at home, that he somehow forgets he was not long ago considered the luckiest of men to win her love. It's not long before he becomes involved with Ruth in a torrid affair. As these things often turn out, Ruth becomes pregnant. With her husband away, there's no way she'll be able to convince him or anyone else that the child she's carrying belongs to Harry Cram. Faced with the risk of losing his own fairly new little family, Buster is terrified of Gladys finding out about the affair and his unborn child. As multiple local attorneys have shared, Buster, after a few drinks, would often admit that he fathered Ruth's child, a baby boy named after her great-grandfather, Robert Vaux, and that early on he'd gone so far as to hire a hitman to get rid of the then pregnant with his own child, Ruth, as told by at least 2 attorneys that he'd confided in. Buster knew of her plan to speak to Gladys. Perhaps Ruth thought telling Gladys would end the marriage, leaving Buster to her instead. No one can be sure, but the hitman was there, taking aim, while Ruth sat on the porch of the home of Buster and Gladys and calmly broke Gladys's heart with the news of her pregnancy and the revelation that Buster was the father. Ruth even went so far as to request that her child be playmates with Randolph III. The hitman told Buster he could not take the shot without risk of harming Gladys, and Buster called it off, not wanting to put Gladys in danger. And after all, the cat was now out of the bag. Buster grabbed a bottle of whiskey and ran like a coward into the night, drinking and driving till the bottle was empty. He stood to lose not just Gladys and Randolph III, but his reputation and career. He ended up at the Savannah River at the Georgia border, where, according to Swamp Kings by Jason Ryan, he sat watching the water flow, later telling a friend that the drunker he got, the braver he got, and turned around to head home. In the end, Gladys took the news that must have been devastating indeed, very calmly, as so many women of her day did. My heart breaks for her, as she must have questioned why, after all she'd done for Buster, bearing his namesake son, being the perfect hostess to countless guests, to boost his standing in the area, supporting the war effort with him, standing by his side through whatever he asked of her, all with a smile on her beautiful face. But publicly, she never faltered. She continued on being the perfect wife for all to see, pretending that all was well. After all, what could she do? South Carolina was the last state to allow divorce. Back in 1878, the South Carolina legislature repealed the state's short-lived divorce law, intentionally granting South Carolina the unique status of being the only state in the nation to prohibit divorce. For the next 71 years, South Carolina stood alone and consistently refused to grant divorces to its citizens. While other states had been legalizing divorce since the early 19th century, South Carolina steadfastly refused. In the short time it was legalized, from 1872 to 1878, the courts granted a total of 157 divorces. Throughout the years following that, a bill advocating some form of divorce appeared before at least one house of the General Assembly almost every year and failed. With pressure from a changing world in the World War II era, South Carolina amended the state constitution in 1949, and the legislature passed a law allowing divorce on 4 grounds: adultery, desertion, physical cruelty, and habitual drunkenness. By the time it was made legal, Gladys was pregnant with who I call the forgotten daughter, because most official sites list Randolph III as Buster and Gladys's only child. So far, I've only seen her listed in a couple of obituaries and as a flower girl in a wedding in 1953. Sadly for Gladys, this wasn't the end of her putting up with Buster's dealings with Ruth. The story would continue publicly and legally throughout the coming years, starting with when her husband came home and refused to allow the child to carry his name. Before divorce became legal, Buster had represented Ruth in the legal separation. Rather than admitting to the adultery, she'd made accusations of mistreatment by her husband. Harry Cram was happy to comply, as he had his next bride lined up. As we'll see in the following articles, things did not proceed well, and many accusations were made. She ended up suing Buster, and Buster filed a countersuit. The case was taken far away to St. Matthews and ended up being settled out of court, perhaps sparing Buster the embarrassment of some of the details. We can see in this map how far away St. Matthews is, both from Buster's Varnville home and especially from Ruth's Bluffton home, and we'll find the reason for that in a moment. This article was found on the front page with plenty more details found on page 3. It's from February the 7th, 1949. A hearing on a suit, and I apologize for how blurry it is. A hearing on a suit and countersuit brought by Solicitor Randolph Murdoch of Hampton of the 14th Judicial Circuit and Mrs. Ruth Vaux Cram of Bluffton was unexpectedly called off this afternoon when lawyers for the two reached an agreement. An order to that effect will be prepared for the signature of Judge Marvin M. Mann of the 1st Judicial Circuit. Solicitor Murdoch was represented by Thomas M. Boulware of Allendale, Sidney S. Tyson of Bennettsville, and Richard A. Palmer of Florence. Only Mr. Boulware was present this afternoon. Mrs. Cram's lawyers were Hugh O'Hanna of Hampton and W. R. Sims of St. Matthews. The hearing was scheduled to be held before Theron A. Hauser, a lawyer and mayor of St. Matthews. He was appointed as special referee in the case by Judge Mann. No details of the agreement were made public by the parties concerned or their lawyers. Solicitor Murdoch's original complaint asked that Mrs. Cram be required to appear and answer all claims involved in the action, that she give a complete accounting of money received by her from him, that he be granted a judgment for any sum or balance due him, that all rights, claims, and demands of both parties be adjudicated and forever settled, and that a permanent restraining order and further relief together with the costs and disbursements of the action. In her answer and cross-bill, Mrs. Cram asked for $9,000 with interest from September 25, 1945, together with $2,000 with interest from October 1945 for 20 cows. The $9,000 represents additional money Mrs. Cram charges is due her from a divorce settlement from Harry S. Cram of Foot Point Plantation, Bluffton. The $2,000 represents the value of 20 cows Mrs. Cram charges she left with Mr. Murdoch, which have never been accounted for. Present with Mrs. Cram at this afternoon's session were Harry S. Cram and the present Mrs. Cram and Mrs. Roland Smith, all of Bluffton. So Buster had helped her with the legal separation. Then that year, divorce became legalized, and he helped her actually carry out the divorce. We find more of the juicy details inside, which describe the wording in the documents as words that would smoke up asbestos paper. The case was transferred here from Hampton County at the request of Thomas M. Boulware, lawyer for Mr. Murdoch, after both Circuit Judge William H. Grimball of Charleston and Judge J. Henry Johnson of Allendale were disqualified. Judge Grimball disqualified himself on the grounds of his friendship with Mr. Murdoch, and Judge Johnson was disqualified when Mr. Boulware announced his intention of calling him to the stand as a witness. Judge Marvin Mann of St. Matthews accepted jurisdiction and appointed Theron Hauser as special referee. The original complaint was filed by Mr. Murdoch against Mrs. Cram in February 1948. On February 25, 1948, Mrs. Cram filed an answer and cross-bill containing 2 causes for action against Mr. Murdoch. Mr. Murdoch's answer was made March 8, 1948. Mr. Murdoch charged in his complaint that he was asked by Mrs. Cram to assist her in obtaining her release from the Navy in September 1944, and that he did so successfully after making several trips to other communities and 2 trips to see United States senators. In her answer, Mrs. Cram stated that she had met Mr. Murdoch casually at a luncheon and had remarked to him that prior to entering the Navy, she had operated Foot Point Plantation and felt that her services were needed in the war effort on the plantation. She charged that Mr. Murdoch told her that he was connected with the Red Cross in Hampton County, and as a Red Cross representative would write a letter requesting her release. Both agreed that no fee was paid. Mr. Murdoch's complaint then charged that Mrs. Cram paid him a $50 retainer because of the manner in which her husband, who was a man of great wealth, was treating her and told him that she was physically injured by her husband and the nurse, that she was not interested in securing any money from her husband for her own necessities, but was solely interested in a legal separation. He said she told him that he could keep for his fee any money received from her husband, but that later she agreed to pay him $10,000. The motion was commenced and Mr. Murdaugh's complaint charged. He told Mrs. Cram that this too must be paid because of considerable expense to which he had been put on traveling and on the loss of 60 days away from his office. So he traveled for 60 days to help her get out of her naval program. 60 days is what he claims. He charged that she then suggested a contingent fee and 50% was agreed upon. He charged that he made a settlement with Mr. Cram of $22,000 plus an attorney's fee of $500, which was paid to him. He paid Mrs. Cram $11,000 and used the $500 to pay other lawyers and some of his own expenses, the complaint said. In addition, Mr. Murdoch charged that he had collected for Miss Cram approximately $4,500 on a mortgage, had advised her on her investments, and advised her in connection with the matter, whereby she obtained approximately $6,700 from an estate, and continued to advise and confer with her until September 11th, 1948, and that no specific fees were charged in this connection. Mrs. Cram's reply stated, information regarding the nurse and Mr. Cram was given at the time Mr. Murdoch was her attorney in his professional capacity, and such communication was and is privileged on the grounds of common decency and foreign to the case. Her answer also said that this defendant positively and affirmatively alleges that said nurse came to defendant's home uninvited by defendant and without defendant's knowledge, and to render no services, professional or otherwise, to defendant. Her answer admits receiving $11,000 in installments from Mr. Murdoch and explained that the $4,500 mortgage was paid by Mr. Cram voluntarily in the separation suit, and that Mr. Murdoch performed no services in connection with it. She denied that Mr. Murdoch had advised her with regards to investments, and that he made a studied effort to find out what investments that this defendant had, and studied effort to get his hands on this defendant's investments and securities. She also said that the $6,700 received from an estate was not obtained through Mr. Murdoch's services, as his only contribution was as a notary public to probate a legal form. Mrs. Cram said, and here's where it gets very juicy indeed. Besides of all these accusations of him making excuses for taking her money that he actually did not do the work to get, Mrs. Cram said that she was not correctly informed as to the amount of the settlement with Mr. Cram, and that the only information she had as to the amount was a written statement left by the plaintiff in his own handwriting that the settlement figure would be $15,000. Now remember this. And it was not until after the settlement was made and the money was paid that the defendant happened to see her former husband in Savannah, and he informed her that he had sent in settlement of the case his check to Brantley Harvey Esquire in the sum of $25,000. So $10,000 more than what Buster told her the settlement was for. A photostatic copy of the check was mailed her by Harry Cram on July 5th, 1945, she said. So she has a handwritten note from Buster saying $15,000 and a copy of the actual check from Mr. Cram for $25,000. So Buster not only put this woman in the position she was in, but stole $10,000 from her while she raised his son by herself. She said that she understood that $2,500 was decided on as Mr. Harvey's fee, and that the remaining $22,500 was turned over to Mr. Murdoch. She said that when she first saw Mr. Murdoch about the separation suit, he offered to handle it without any fee or compensation, but that she had insisted it be on a business basis, and that she would pay him the same fee paid Mr. Harvey by Mr. Cram. She said that Mr. Murdoch agreed to pay her the remaining $9,000 she charges as due her, but returned to Hampton and wrote her a letter offering her $4,000, which she refused to accept in settlement. In his answer in reply, Mr. Murdoch denied Mrs. Cram's charges, The claim for $2,000 for 20 cows was based on charges in her second cause of action, in which she said that she had 21 cows valued at $100 each. When she moved away from her plantation, she charges, she had no place to move the cows, and Mr. Murdoch told her that he had a suitable place near Varnville. She arranged to have the cows transported there and charged that Mr. Murdoch told her that he would take care of them until she sold them. She gave him 1 cow for his services, she said. Later, she sent some cattle buyers to see the cows, but charged they were told by an agent or employee of Mr. Murdoch's that the cows were being held for a fee. She charged that Mr. Murdoch had never made any accounting or paid any monies to the defendant Ruth Vaux Cram for the cows. Mr. Murdoch's answer stated that the cows were delivered to his farm without his knowledge. Now that's kind of hard to believe. How are you going to send 21 cows to someone's house without their knowledge? That he had objected to their delivery and told Mrs. Cram that he had no place to take care of them. He complained that the cows were wild and unruly and wandered, destroying farmers' crops, the cost of which had been paid by him. He went on to claim the cows were diseased. He charged, and the disease spread to his own cattle. The animals all died, he said, with the exception of 2, one of which was sold to take care of expenses incurred when the cows broke out and for veterinarian's fees. The other cow was killed after it broke out and was cut on a wire fence. He charged that he and members of his office force had repeatedly attempted to get Mrs. Cram to move the animals from his farm. He said he had informed Mrs. Cram of the death of the cows. Both Mr. Murdoch and Mrs. Cram asked that the other suits be dismissed with costs. Now it's interesting to me that Ruth's ex-husband attended this hearing, no doubt coming as a witness to all these facts. We also know the case gets settled without going to court. I would love to hear you guys' opinions and comments about what you think the truth is about these suits. In Swamp Kings, it says that one low country lawyer marveled at the damage wrought by Buster at Foot Point. When Harry Cram came back home from war, quipped the lawyer, the cows were gone, the trees were cut, the plantation had a mortgage, and he had another son. After this article that we just read was printed, Buster, who thought he had protected himself by putting distance and settling out of court, was quite angry and published his own scathing letter in the Hampton County Guardian, stating, reputable lawyers make it a practice not to try cases in the newspaper. He nevertheless proceeded to challenge Hannah's assertions and minimize the rancor on display between him and Ruth Vaux, who he described deliberately and unflatteringly as a very wealthy northern woman. He mocked Ruth for having difficulty finding legal counsel, suggesting this meant her legal complaints were trifling. Probably had more to do with who her foe was, and then goes on to try to minimize his wrongdoing and put himself in a beneficial light. He says, I might say in passing that there was nothing unusual about the matter at all, except a difference between Mrs. Cram and myself as to the amount of the fee. My position was substantiated by many reputable citizens, including 2 circuit judges who would have testified had the case proceeded to trial. Frankly, an attempt is being made to make much ado about nothing, and then went on to say that it was his political enemies attempting to hurt him and spread malicious rumors. What in the world do his political enemies have to do with this situation and all of the ways that he took advantage of Ruth Vaux? But this wasn't the first time or the last time that Buster is accused of not paying what he owes or taking clients' money. So Alex was not the first Murdoch to be accused of stealing. Turns out that started with his grandfather before him. Ruth Vaux lived the rest of her life in South Carolina. Strangely, Buster and even Randolph III continued to help her in different situations for the rest of her life. She was an avid golfer, with her name appearing in the paper often for local golf tournaments. She was also known for being a member of the Board of Trustees for Beaufort Memorial Hospital, and there is an award still being given in her name, the most recent being just last month In the article, it says that this award is named in memory of Ruth Vaux, a longtime Bluffton resident and former member of the Beaufort Memorial Hospital Board of Trustees. She raised her son, Buster's son that is, Robert Vaux, named for her great-grandfather, locally as well, where he became an attorney too. Buster was said to acknowledge his fatherhood of Robert's, often while drunk, though never publicly accepted the claim. People who knew Buster often said they were built the same, walked the same, and looked the same. Judge for yourself in this video. Robert's son, Tabor Vaux, is an attorney as well, whom you may have seen mentioned in my episodes about the Renee Beach conspiracy case, where he works together with Mark Tinsley. With the divorce finally out of the way, Harry Cram was able to marry the woman who had already mistakenly been called Mrs. Cram, Lucy Ladd Guest, on April the 12th, 1950. And so we come to the close of Murdoch Mafia Episode 2, They Call Me Big Daddy. There's plenty more to go in this series, and I thank you for watching. This is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.